Good evening. Welcome to another episode of History Done Right. My name is Timothy Barrett, and I'm the one that plods through these episodes. This is episode 16, apparently, of our History Done Right series. If you're new to the series, I'd encourage you to go to the Bradford Christian College YouTube channel. Click on playlists. You will find the History Done Right playlist there, and you can view the previous episodes. I'd really encourage you to view the first 2 or 3 episodes where we really lay the groundwork for what we mean by history done right. Yeah, and so that would be a great way for you to get started into this series. Most recently, we have been looking at that history that is the fall of man. And so we've been looking at that, understanding how that's causative of later effects, how that explains history. And that's really, in large part, what we mean by history done right, is actually dealing with the real history of mankind as a basis for deciding what uh, what's happened in history and how we are to understand what's happened in history. All right, my camera's not behaving the way I want, so see if we can. Anyway, um, things went kind of wonky on for me before I got started tonight. Anyway, that just lets you know that I don't know what I'm doing. I hope you know what's going on. You can comment below and straighten me out about things. But um, back to our history, right? We're understanding the import of the fall of man and how that lays a groundwork for all the history that comes after that. And so that's really what we've been we've been looking at now. Um, we started a timeline here of what's been going on. We haven't gotten very far because we're somewhere 10 plus days into the history of the world, according to Bishop Usher. And again, let me just say these dates that I've written here, the orange, the Julian, the blue, I guess it is, the bluish, the uh, Gregorian calendar. The specific days that I've got listed there, just to help us keep in mind the passage of time, because this is real history. This isn't just made up stuff, and it's not that, the days are whatever. The days are days. And so the earth is 7 days old on that first Sabbath. And presumably at some point after that first Sabbath, Bishop Usher suggests maybe 3 days after that, the fall of man occurs. Again, that's to help us see the passage of time. And so we're going to try to maintain that dates and such as we fill in more of our timeline here going forward. But currently, we are really delving into this um, the fall, because it turns out to be pretty significant in the whole scope of history. Because, well, teaser here, the single most important event in history, at least is where we are in the study of history, is yet to come. Of course, in real life, it's already happened, and that is the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as we're looking at the fall of man, we are understanding from that perspective at the fall of man the importance of Christ coming into history. And one of the ways that we were understanding that, and this is where we were reading last time, reading from this text, the history of redemption by Jonathan Edwards. And to me, quite interesting that he suggests that Christ takes upon him the office and work of a mediator between God and man at that moment of the fall. In fact, let's just read what we were reading here as we ended last time. And therefore, we may suppose that immediately on the fall of Adam, it was made known in heaven among the angels that God had a design of redemption with respect to fallen man, that Christ had now taken upon him the office and work of a mediator between God and man, and that they were to be subservient to him in this office. And I think last time I was making the point, this may not be true for you, this may not be your life experience or your Christian journey, but I would very much say it's mine. I never have heard this kind of instruction and teaching, preaching before. And I think it's significant to consider this. It really emphasizes the from eternity plan that God had. That there would be a plan of redemption, a plan of buying back, a plan of rescuing and saving fallen man. Something that wasn't available, isn't available, never will be available to fallen angels. The angels of heaven, I think the last time I quoted the great Andre Crouch, and the lyrics to one of his songs, that when I say I've been redeemed, the angels must fold their wings. Redemption is something that they witness, but they don't themselves experience. All right, let's continue with our Jonathan Edwards' History of Redemption work here. Roman numeral 2. Presently, upon this, the gospel was first revealed on earth in these words, Genesis 3:15. We've talked about this before. And now quoting Genesis 3:15, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. God is addressing himself to the serpent, but in the presence of Adam and Eve as well. It shall bruise thy head, it, the seed of the woman, and you, serpent, shall bruise his heel, the heel of the seed of the woman. And notice how Edwards describes this, that this was the gospel. And we talked about how that was good news, and that apparently um, Adam and Eve received it as good news, because remember, it's after that gospel proclamation that Adam now names his wife Eve, meaning the mother of all the living. And so this anticipation of her seed, a seed following, right? And why would that be important to them? Well, because they heard the gospel, that this seed that is yet to come would actually destroy the deceiver, the one who is very truly responsible for Adam and Eve falling into sin, which is not to excuse Adam and Eve of their responsibility for the sin that they committed. We must suppose that God's intention of redeeming fallen man was first signified in heaven before it was on earth, because the business of the angels as ministering spirits of the mediator required it. For as soon as Christ had taken on him the work of a mediator, it was requisite that the angels should be ready immediately to be subservient to him in that office, so that the light first dawned in heaven, but very soon afterwards the same was signified on earth. In those words of God, there was an intimation of another surety to be appointed for man after the first surety had failed. This was the first revelation of the covenant of grace, the first dawning of the light of the gospel on earth. Okay, so parallelism, right? The gospel, the covenant of grace. We're saying the same thing. Now, it seems to me like Edwards is suggesting a logical order of things here. That heaven is alerted that the mediator has now taken up his office. Why? Because the angels need to be ready to be subservient to the mediator. But then why does he take up the office of mediator? Not just for the benefit, not actually at all for the benefit of the angels. He takes it up for the benefit of man, those who need redemption, those who need a mediator. All right, continuing on. This world before the fall enjoyed noonday light, the light of the knowledge of God, of his glory, and of his favor. Okay, so all of this right here is Edwards explaining what he means by this noonday light reference. But when man fell, all this light was at once extinguished and the world reduced again to total darkness. A darkness worse than that which was in the beginning of the world, Genesis 1:2. And now quoting from Genesis 1:2, darkness was upon the face of the deep. A darkness 1,000 times more remediless than that. Okay, so think about this darkness in Genesis 1:2. How was it remedied? It was remedied by the creative work of God, right? That creative work of God, the spoken word, the Father speaking the word, and the Son executing, carrying out the word. The word activated, if you will. But we know from the Old Testament that Christ is credited as the creative mover. And so in the creation story as given to us in Genesis 1, we are actually given a picture of Christ's redemptive work of mankind, because everything, the material world that is created begins void and without form in darkness. And the work of Christ, as directed by the Father, is to bring forth beauty from that darkness, that chaos, that void state. And that's a picture of how it is that Christ works, how it is that he takes that which is formless and void and dark and fills it with life and life abundantly. Okay, that's the creation story. That's the lesson that is taught in that creation story over those 6 days of creation. What Christ the mediator is going to do for lost man, who is now by his sinful act plunged himself into darkness, a darkness like unto the darkness that there was before the creative acts of God through Christ. Okay, and so the anticipation is that But we read about through creation, the 6 days of creation, and how much life and beauty and wonder and goodness comes forth because of the creative work of Christ, because of the mediatorial work of Christ. That same thing's going to happen in the lives of those whom he saves. All right, so um, Edwards here is saying that when man fell, he's into this total darkness, a darkness worse than the darkness that was there before the creative work of the 6 days of creation. He goes on to say, neither men nor angels could find out any way whereby this darkness might be scattered. It appeared in its blackness when Adam and his wife saw that they were naked and sewed fig leaves to cover themselves, when they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden and hid themselves among the trees. Remember, we read Matthew Henry about that and how presumably there was really nothing different about how God came into the garden on that day. Right? What was different was the wounded consciences of Adam and Eve, so that the same voice that they'd heard before that was attractive to them and drew them to God as he came into the garden was now um, scary to them, fearful to them, and they hid from it. Not because God had changed, right? When God first called them to an account and said to Adam, what is that you have done? Have you eaten of the tree whereof I commanded you that you should not eat? Then we may suppose that their hearts were filled with shame and terror. Okay, now I want to pause for a moment here and let's think about this. If we take mankind as a collective, right? Not each of mankind individually, but if we take mankind as a collective, right? Collectively, in our day, I don't know that mankind is filled with shame and terror um, concerning the sin that mankind commits. And so, just like we talk about an individual over time can become callous to a conscience that initially is sensitive to violation of God's law and character. And so there can be the guilt, the feeling of guilt. But if you continue to abuse that, it calluses and hardens, and the feeling of guilt dwindles, right? So that can happen in the life of an individual, but I think that happens like for mankind collectively, right? So that um, there's not right the feeling collectively, the feeling of shame over certain behaviors that are clearly contrary to God's standards, God's word. That's faded, right? And so things that people, if they engaged in, they would do in the dark, right? They would do it in dark alleys, dirty places, in hiding. Um, Now that's not the case. They parade, right? Because the collectively the sense of shame and terror has faded. Okay, so again, Jonathan Edwards here says that when God now appears in the garden, and up until that time, that had been a thing that attracted Adam and Eve, right? Drew them to him because, oh, here he is in the garden, we can walk with him. Now they hide from him, and that elicits these questions from God, not because God is ignorant of anything that's happened. These are questions that are, in fact, intended, I would say, to heighten that sense of guilt, that shame, that terror, because Adam and Eve need to know without question that they are guilty. I mean, this is how you give a full presentation of the gospel, of the right. You make it clear the guilt of mankind, right? A preacher who's rightly preaching the whole gospel, I mean, is going to preach the law and the gospel. Here is, the preacher needs to be one who stands in the place of authority, the pulpit, and proclaims, beloved, you are guilty, and needs to proclaim it in a way that all of those in his audience would feel the pang of guilt for their sin. Because then the preacher in that place of authority in the pulpit has the blessed duty of delivering the cure. And that is what Jonathan Edwards writes here. But these words of God, Genesis 3:15, were the first dawning of gospel light after this dismal darkness, right? Remember up here he talked about, well, how can the darkness be scattered? How can we chase the darkness away? Well, men or angels don't know how, right? Adam and Eve didn't know how to scatter the darkness. All they knew to do was to hide. You don't see angels coming down and taking care of it. They're stumped. They don't know what to do. They don't know about this thing, redemption. They don't know. They don't have the gospel message. So realize that the one who is the offended in this incident, okay, Adam and Eve aren't the offended ones. They are the offenders, right? The one who is offended is the one with the cure. And that's the gospel of Genesis 3:15. Before this, there was not one glimpse of light, any beam of comfort, or the least hope. It was an obscure yet comprehensive revelation of the gospel, not indeed made to Adam or Eve directly, but contained in what God said to the serpent. We talked about that. Like when God proclaims, think about how powerful the gospel is, right? Because that message, Genesis 3:15, spoken to the serpent, is the death sentence to the serpent, right? The seed of the woman will crush your head. Your days are numbered, serpent. Um, the hero is coming, and he will thoroughly defeat you, monster. Right? I mean, that's the threat of the gospel to the serpent is a blessed cure to Adam and Eve. All right, let's continue. One of those great things intended to be done by the work of redemption is more plainly intimated: God's subduing his enemies under the feet of his son. Okay, so here's another example of, if I'll just be quiet and we read on, this is what I was just saying. So think about this. We're talking about one of those great things intended to be done by the work of redemption, right? Because when we think of the work of redemption, we think of, oh, Jesus rescues me, right? Jesus saves me. He buys me back. But that's just part of the work of redemption. Look at this. One of the great things, Jonathan Edwards writes, that is accomplished in the work of redemption. It's God's subduing his enemies under the feet of his son, right? That is a substantive part of the work of redemption, right? So think about this. If, God willing, by his grace, if I am part of the redeemed, right, I become part of the body of Christ. The enemy, my enemy, the enemy of Christ, the enemy of God, is under the feet of Christ. It means that by Christ's work, that enemy is under the redeemed as the body of Christ. So God's design of this was now first declared, right? So when you think of the word redemption, okay, oftentimes the only way that that's spoken of is the buying back of the lost. Okay, like you were lost in your sin, you were bound in chains of sin, however, and here comes Christ and he redeems you, he buys you back. That's just part of redemption, because another part of redemption, as clearly stated in Genesis 3:15, is, well, in fact, in Genesis 3:15, it's really the substance of that verse, the subduing of God's enemies under the feet of his son, our mediator, Christ. So then notice here, Satan, it says, probably triumphed greatly in the fall of man, as though he had defeated the designs of God in his creation. Okay, so the way this is written here, it might make more sense to us now if it said Satan probably celebrated greatly in the fall of man, as though he had defeated the designs of God in his creation, right? This is like if you've ever seen the videos online of don't celebrate early, right? Celebrating too soon. But in these words, God gives him a plain intimation that he should not finally triumph, but that a complete victory and triumph should be obtained over him by the seed of the woman. Right? So, again, think about this, that the work of redemption, as expressed for the first time in Scripture, um, in Genesis 3:15, is not expressed as repurchase, the buying back of sinners from the bondage of sin. It's not presented that way here. I'm not saying that that's not what redemption is. I mean, redemption is clearly redeeming, buying back. It is. But the way it's initially expressed in Genesis 3:15 is God saying to the serpent, stop celebrating, because complete victory and triumph is coming and you will be crushed. Okay. Roman numeral 3. Soon after this, I think soon after Genesis 3:15, the custom of sacrificing was appointed to be a standing type of the sacrifice of Christ till he should come and offer up himself a sacrifice to God. Okay, so we have a standing type, right? So if you've read the Old Testament, you might be familiar with the sacrificial system. Okay, somewhat complicated system. It had to be repeated and repeated and repeated. A lot of spilled blood. But that was a standing type. So what does that mean to be a standing type, a type of something? Well, a type is a thing that represents the actual thing. Um, it is the shadow of the real thing, the substance. So all those sacrifices that we read about in the Old Testament, those are shadows of the substantive sacrifice of Christ that for them in the Old Testament was yet to come. But think about it. um, let's take a dad in Old Testament days and his son. And the dad has selected the proper lamb, let's just say. And he and his son with that lamb are making their way to where it is that they have to, offer their lamb to be a sacrifice to cover the sins of the family. And as they're walking, the son says, "So, Dad, what are we doing?" And the dad would say, "Well, we're following the law, which requires that we take a lamb and we spill its blood to cover our sins." And the son might say, "Well, how does the blood of the lamb cover our sin?" And the dad might say, "Well, that's what the law explains to us, that um, the way in which sin is covered and therefore we're not punished for it is there's the shedding of the blood, and we're able to use a lamb and shed its blood to do that for us." And the son might say, "Well, how do we know that that blood will really cover our sin?" And the dad would say, "Well, we have faith. We believe that that's what it will do because we're told by God that that's how he'll receive it. And so we have faith." What's interesting about that is that, we read about all the ceremony and all the tradition and all the careful ways in which these sacrifices had to be done, but ultimately it was a matter of faith. Having faith that the proper sacrifice, properly sacrificed, would be sufficient to do what it was um, declared to do by the law. And so you see, it wasn't any different for them because in my little scenario, dad would eventually talk to his son about how the sacrifices we're doing now with the lamb is a picture of, it's a shadow of the perfect sacrifice that will be done. And that's what we really believe in. That's what we really have faith in, that perfect sacrifice will come. And that perfect sacrifice did come. and that was Christ. And so it never has been any different. It's always come down to a matter of faith. All right. It is very probable that sacrifice was instituted immediately after God had revealed the covenant of grace, Genesis 3:15. Now this is helpful here, right? God revealed the covenant of grace, Genesis 3:15, right? Because talk about the gospel is preached, but thinking about Genesis 3:15 as the covenant of grace is really helpful. Because at the most critical moment in the history of mankind, when grace was desperately needed, it appears, right? It enters into the history of mankind, the covenant of grace. Right? So many times within Christianity, the presentation is such that we think grace is not part of our Old Testament. And yet, when we think about the law, usually we think about Moses, right? But before Moses and the giving of the law, the Ten Commandments, which we most often think of when we think of the law, there was grace, right? Now, when Adam and Eve are in the garden before the fall, right? Uh, they don't desperately need God's grace. They enjoy his blessing, right? His goodness, his kindness, his provision, his providence. And then they commit sin and they are now at enmity with him. Now they desperately need grace. And it's delivered. Grace is proclaimed immediately. Okay, so again, to Jonathan Edwards, it is very probable that sacrifice was instituted immediately after God had revealed the covenant of grace as the foundation on which the custom of sacrificing was built. That promise was the first stone laid towards this glorious building, the work of redemption. And the next stone was the institution of sacrifices to be a type of the great sacrifice, right? So once again, we see that whatever I was talking about, Jonathan Edwards would get to in a much better way if we just read on. But again, Edwards is talking about this work of redemption. We've already seen that, Genesis 3:15. If we talk about that verse as the covenant of grace, what is that verse about? It's about the seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent. It's a violent verse, but it's a glorious verse. It establishes the covenant of grace. It is the gospel. It is the good news to Adam and Eve. It's the good news to you and me. It's not good news for the serpent, right? And through it, Edwards says we get the institution of sacrifices. Think about the Old Testament sacrifices to be a type of the great sacrifice. And that, of course, is Christ himself. The next thing of which we have an account after God had pronounced sentence on the serpent, on the woman, and on the man was that God made them coats of skins and clothed them, which are generally thought to be the skins of beasts slain in sacrifice. Okay, so I think that's generally thought to be the case, right? Adam and Eve had no concept of the need for blood to be spilled because of the sin that they had committed. They had to be taught that. And so they were taught. And I presume that they were made to witness the killing of a beast, the shedding of its blood. That's going to emblazon the seriousness of their sin in their mind. And then they're clothed in the skin of these beasts that had to be killed. Their blood had to be shed for the covering, the dealing with the sin that they had committed. And so presumably that's what um, is happening here, and how it is that um, the skins of beasts slain in sacrifice become the clothes that Adam and Eve wear. And as Edwards points out, for we have no account of anything else that should be the occasion of man's slaying beasts, except to offer them in sacrifice till after the flood. Men were not wont to eat the flesh of beasts as their common food till after the flood, right? So eating meat, right? Eating meat was not, at least from what we see in scripture, was not something that was done until after the flood, eating meat. And so the only thing would be sacrifice. The food of man before the fall was the fruit of the trees of paradise, and after the fall, his food was the produce of the field, as we read in Genesis 3:18, thou shalt eat the herb of the field, right? So they went from fruit to grain. The first grant that he had to eat flesh as his common food was after the flood, to meat. Genesis 9:3, every moving thing that lives shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. That's Genesis 9:3. So so we see the um, advancing in the diet of mankind. All right, so that it is likely these skins with which Adam and Eve were clothed were the skins of their sacrifices. God's clothing them with these was a lively figure of their being clothed with the righteousness of Christ. This clothing was not of their own obtaining, but God gave it them. It is said, God made them coats of skins and clothed them, as the righteousness with which we are clothed is of God. It is He only clothes the naked soul. Right? So again, this is all typology, right? I mean, this is a continuation of the preaching of the gospel to Adam and Eve. Okay. All right. And so for Adam and Eve, God is letting them know you've sinned, right? Um, that means you shall surely die, but your mediator is at work. And your mediator has a way of covering that sin and clothing you in righteousness. And God demonstrates that for them. He teaches them that this is what the great sacrifice will do for you. It will clothe you in righteousness, His righteousness. Our first parents who were naked were clothed at the expense of life. Beasts were slain to afford them clothing. The institution of sacrifices was a great thing done towards preparing the way for Christ's coming and working out redemption. For the sacrifices of the Old Testament were the principle of all the Old Testament types of Christ and his redemption. Okay, so the sacrifices of the Old Testament types of Christ and his redemption. And it tended to establish in the minds of God's visible church the necessity of a propitiatory sacrifice in order to the deities being satisfied for sin. Okay, so propitiatory, right? Probably a word that maybe this is the first time you've heard it. So let's take a moment and do some Webster's work here. So propitiatory, having the power to make propitious as a propitiatory sacrifice. Well, propitious, right here, favorable, kind, disposed to be gracious or merciful, ready to forgive sins and bestow blessings applied to God, right? So, um, a lot of times the when we talk about the gospel or we talk about Christianity, um, we can ask people, what do they think about Jesus? And they might respond, well, Jesus is just all right with me. Some of you will know the reference. You can put in the comments what that refers to. But the real question is not, as we encounter people, are they going to think nicely about Jesus? Are they going to smile at Jesus? That's not the issue that mankind faces, right? It's not that the world would be a better place if more people smiled at Jesus, because that's not the problem. As hard as it might be to understand, or it's the problem is that God is not smiling at enough people. Okay. You see, many people, maybe most people, I don't know. I'll say many people. But again, it could be most people. Sadly, maybe it is most people. They actually are living their life, and they could be smiling at Jesus all day long, but they're still living a life under a countenance of wrath from God. That God looks upon them in his wrath because they are deserving of punishment. They're living under the judgment of God's righteousness, his justice. And what many, maybe most, desperately need is for that to change, that God's countenance of wrath would change to a propitious countenance, so that the God who looks upon them with the countenance of wrath, who is disposed to bring judgment upon them, his countenance would change and he would now be disposed to be gracious to them. He would be ready to forgive sin and bestow blessing, rather than to judge sin and bestow judgment. Okay? That's what's needed. And that's where propitiation comes in. That's where this propitiatory sacrifice is so important. Because propitiation, if you notice here, propitiation, in theology, oops, didn't mean to do that. In theology, the atonement or atoning sacrifice offered to God to assuage his wrath, right? Remember, many, maybe most people are living in a state where they're under God's wrath. And again, those people may be smiling at Jesus, but it doesn't matter. because God's countenance towards them is a countenance of wrath. So, how do you assuage, or how do you change God's countenance toward you? Or let me say that better. How is God's countenance changed towards you from one of wrath and render him propitious to sinners? Well, if God is propitious to sinners, what does that mean? Well, again, to the definition of propitious, disposed to be gracious or merciful, ready to forgive sin and bestow blessing. How does that change so that God becomes like this towards me rather than like this? Look at the next sentence in Webster's definition. Christ is the propitiation for the sins of men. Okay? So this is the condition of many, maybe most of mankind. They are living under God's wrath. God is disposed to carry out justice against them. And that needs to change. And Christ is the change. Christ is the propitiation. Christ is the one who can change that countenance of wrath that God has towards sinners and can turn it to become a countenance that is gracious and merciful and ready to forgive sins and bestow blessing. That's what Jonathan Edwards is talking about here. So, the Old Testament types of Christ and his redemption, tended to establish in the minds of God's visible church the necessity of a propitiatory sacrifice in order to the deity's being satisfied for sin, and so prepared the way for the reception of the glorious gospel that reveals the great sacrifice not only in the visible church but through the world of mankind. For from this institution of sacrifices, all nations derived the custom of sacrificing to the gods to atone for their sins. Yeah, so think about the history. Think about the history and what's going on, right? From this institution of sacrifices, all nations derived the custom of sacrificing to the gods to atone for their sins. So here's something that we need to understand about history. You see, unbiblical or non-biblical history suggests that mankind started in some kind of polytheistic, perhaps religion, kind of mystical, like um, all kinds of things are gods over them, and it kind of narrowed down into the emergence of monotheistic religion. But that's not true history. That is not history done right. History done right understands that man started with the truth, monotheistic, that there is one God, the creator of all things. That's where mankind started in his religion, with one God. And he understood that that one God was offended by the sin of Adam and Eve, the parents of all the living. And that one God needed to be um, satisfied. His justice needed to be satisfied. And that one God gave a system, an institution of sacrifice to satisfy him, because it was a reminder to him and a preaching to mankind of the one great sacrifice that would come, Jesus himself. But Edwards is doing history right. Because from this truth that there is one offended God who needs to be satisfied through sacrifice, and the sacrificial system that he instituted is teaching the people and a reminder to him of the one great sacrifice that will happen in history, that is Jesus Christ. That's what gets distorted. That's what gets um, uh, twisted by the sinfulness of mankind, and it becomes this custom of sacrificing to the gods now to atone for their sins. And as Edwards points out, no nation, however barbarous, was found without it, without this custom of some kind of sacrifice. Why? Because everybody knows they're guilty. I've talked about this before. This is a truth of history. Everybody knows they're guilty before God, and they're trying to figure out, how do I deal with that guilt? Well, for many nations, it became um, making up other gods and doing all kinds of elaborate sacrificial things to atone for their sins. Edwards writes, this is a great evidence of the truth of revealed religion. For no nation, except the Jews, could tell how they came by this custom, or to what purpose it was to offer sacrifices to their deities. So this is what happens when you, not you, but this is what happens when somebody perverts away from the truth. They end up with a custom, a thing to be done, but they have no understanding of why they're doing it. They might have some vague explanation of, they don't really, but they don't really know, because they've wandered from the truth. And so they end up in a place where, to their made up gods, they're doing made up sacrifices for whatever reasons. And you end up with fertility gods and whatever else kind of gods. And we must sacrifice to them. Why? Notice what Edwards writes: the light of nature did not teach them any such thing. That did not teach them that the gods were hungry and fed upon the flesh which they burnt in sacrifice, and yet they all had this custom, of which no other account can be given, but that they derived it from Noah, who had it from his ancestors, on whom God had enjoined it as a type of the great sacrifice of Christ. Right? And so, Edwards is getting at something pretty significant here. We're not going to take the time now, because we need to wrap up for this episode, but this will be a place for us to start next time, right? Because remember, everything that was practiced prior to the flood gets crystallized or centralized in Noah and his family, right? And they become the ones who, after the flood, will continue those traditions that were going on before the flood. And so all the nations, because we don't have nations until after the flood. I mean, I don't know, maybe there were nations before the flood, but they don't matter, because all we have is Noah and his family. And it's out of Noah and his family after the flood that we get the nations of the earth that we know today, the people groups that we know today. Well, of course, some of them have disappeared, right? They've died out. We don't have them anymore, but that's where we get the nations, right? And these nations develop their traditions, their practices, their customs, their sacrificial systems, Where did they get all that? Well, ultimately, they get it from Noah, who presumably, we know that when he comes off the ark, he builds an altar and sacrifices, I believe, right? So um, it's there. How well was it understood by Noah? I think well. How well was it understood by his sons? Well, maybe not as well. And then it becomes less well understood, it would seem. So we'll pick up at this point next time. And what Jonathan Edwards is going to get at here, it would seem, uh, is that he's going to give explanation as to why we end up with the varied sacrificial systems among the nations, right? But for now, I want us to think about this truth in history, just as we talked about that the real history doesn't tell us that men mankind started off grunting and groaning and kind of climbed his way out of that condition to be able to speak and form sentences and complex thoughts and that sort of thing. That's not how true history is. True history is that mankind started at a very elevated level, very intelligent, able to speak, able to communicate, able to have complex thoughts. So he started at a very high level, and then the consequences of sin was to degrade him down from that level to a less intelligent level. That's what sin does. Sin makes us less intelligent, less smart. And then in terms of religion, mankind doesn't start as a superstitious being that's scared of fire and lightning and thinks himself governed by the stars and everything is potentially a god to him. That's not how he begins. He begins clearly understanding there's one God. I mean, good grief, he walked and talked with him. He knows there to be one God and one God only. And so mankind begins monotheistic. And if we want to then jump to the flood, where all mankind is contained in 8 people, Noah and his family, they are monotheistic. And it's only after that that they, because of the consequences of sin, the sinful nature, that they degrade into some kind of a polytheistic, multiple gods kind of thinking. And see that, so it's not that, it's not as history presents, where um, coming to a place of monotheism is something later. That's how it all begins. And polytheism, multiple gods, is the decline of mankind religiously. Okay, we'll need to stop there with this episode. Hopefully, you found this instructive and educational. Please like, share, and subscribe, and all of that. Um, Again, let's see if we can build a community. Leave comments. Let's talk about what it is that we're hearing in this as we consider history done right. So, thanks for being a part of this episode. Bradford Christian College YouTube channel. Click playlists. You can find History Done Right and watch any of the previous episodes. Please join us again, Lord willing, next week as we continue our study.